The narrow, gaslit streets of Whitechapel held their secrets close, and none was darker than the figure of Jack the Ripper. The year was 1888, and London was in the grip of a terror so profound that people couldn't walk the streets at night without glancing over their shoulders. Somewhere in the maze of alleys and tenements, a killer lurked. He was unseen, a shadow moving silently through the fog, leaving behind only corpses and questions. Whispers spread quickly, each one adding a darker twist to the story. Who was he? And as theories swirled, one name kept resurfacing, a name wrapped in the strange whispers of his own neighbors, Aaron Kosminski. Kosminski was a barber by trade, a Polish immigrant who had come to London with his family to escape persecution in their homeland. They settled in Whitechapel, and Aaron took up work in a small barber shop on one of the bustling streets, his life unremarkable to most. But beneath the surface, something twisted and angry simmered. Aaron was known to be erratic, prone to fits of rage and odd mutterings. His disdain for women, especially those who worked as prostitutes, was whispered among his family, but no one spoke of it openly. Some neighbors claimed he muttered to himself in Yiddish about cleansing the streets. But in the noisy tenements of Whitechapel, strange behavior often went unnoticed until the killings began. The horror started on August 31st, 1888, with the brutal murder of Mary Ann Nichols. Her body was found at dawn, her throat slashed with such ferocity that her head was nearly severed. Her abdomen was mutilated, carved with an almost clinical precision. The city was horrified, and the police puzzled. This wasn't an ordinary murder, but one that showed a twisted intelligence, a dark purpose. Then came Annie Chapman's murder just days later, her body desecrated in a similarly calculated way. Rumors circulated that the killer had medical knowledge, a familiarity with anatomy. This was no amateur, but someone who knew precisely what he was doing. And who, with each killing, seemed to grow bolder, more daring. Aaron Kosminski's family had tried for years to manage his erratic behavior. He was known for his hatred toward women, particularly those who walked the streets at night. He would often wander Whitechapel in the dead of night, muttering to himself, sometimes cursing under his breath as if arguing with unseen figures. He refused to bathe, shunning even the most basic hygiene, and would sit alone in dark corners, eyes flickering with a strange, almost feverish light. His sisters were afraid of him, yet they dared not speak of his darker side. Instead, they whispered among themselves, wondering how long his rage could be contained. The third murder, that of Elizabeth Stride, sent even deeper shockwaves through the city. She was found in a dark alley, her throat slashed but body largely intact. Police speculated that the killer had been interrupted mid-act, his work unfinished. But less than an hour later, another body was discovered, that of Catherine Eddowes. Her face was mutilated beyond recognition, her organs carefully removed and arranged beside her. The brutality had escalated, the killer growing more ruthless with each passing night. It was then that a critical piece of evidence surfaced, one that would linger in the case for over a century. Near Eddowes' body, a blood-stained shawl was found, its origins unknown, preserved by a police officer who hoped it might one day yield clues. For years it sat, a silent witness to the horrors of that night, until technology finally caught up with it. Decades later, DNA testing would reveal something chilling. Traces of genetic material linked not only to Catherine Eddowes, but also to a descendant of Aaron Kosminski. Though DNA evidence from such an old sample is not infallible, it was enough to renew interest in Kosminski, painting him as the figure that many had long suspected him to be. As the police scoured Whitechapel, looking for clues and trying to make sense of the Ripper's madness, their gaze turned repeatedly to Kosminski. He was questioned, but he offered little in the way of explanation. He would stare blankly, often unresponsive, as if lost in a world only he could see. His family, fearful of public disgrace, downplayed his violent tendencies, urging the police to look elsewhere. But the authorities couldn't ignore the signs. Reports from detectives noted his hostility towards women, his erratic behavior, and his tendency to lurk in the streets late at night. Though they lacked the evidence needed for a conviction, Kosminski remained on their radar, a dark figure haunting the investigation. One of the most compelling witnesses was a Jewish man who claimed to have seen the Ripper up close on the night of one of the murders. He identified the man as someone with a familiar face, but he was reluctant to testify openly. The witness, aware of the anti-Semitic sentiments that ran through the city, feared that implicating a fellow immigrant, a fellow Jew, would bring disgrace and even danger to his own community. Still, he confided in certain officers, his descriptions aligning disturbingly well with Kosminski's appearance. Though his testimony would never make it to court, it lingered in police files, a quiet echo of the terror he'd seen in those shadowed streets. By the time the Ripper's last victim, Mary Jane Kelly, was found mutilated beyond recognition, the people of London had begun to suspect that their city was under siege by a madman. But this was no ordinary lunatic. This was a killer with precision, intelligence, and an unquenchable thirst for violence. Mary Jane was the Ripper's ultimate canvas, her body displayed in her own room as if he had finally unleashed every dark impulse he'd kept hidden. And then, silence. The killing stopped as suddenly as they had begun. The city breathed a sigh of relief, but the people of Whitechapel could not shake the feeling that the killer was still among them, lurking in the fog. Kosminski's behavior only grew more disturbing in the following months. He became more withdrawn, speaking less, muttering to himself more often. His outbursts turned violent, and he would strike out at those around him without provocation. His family, unable to control him, finally had him committed to an asylum in 1891. There, in the bleak, damp walls of Colney Hatch Lunatic Asylum, Kosminski lived out his days, his mind unraveling completely. Reports from the asylum described him as paranoid, violent, prone to fits of anger and periods of silence where he would sit, staring into nothing, his eyes blank and haunted. His fixation on women continued, and though he no longer posed a threat to the outside world, the staff regarded him with unease. Some say the killing stopped because the Ripper was finally caged, locked away in the asylum where his madness could no longer reach the streets of London. For years, detectives would revisit Kosminski's case, examining the pieces that seemed to fit so disturbingly well. There was the DNA on the shawl, the witness who had seen him near the crime scene, the police officers who wrote in their reports that they believed Kosminski was the Ripper. But it was all circumstantial, fragments of a nightmare that could never be pieced together in full. In his final years, Kosminski's condition worsened, his mind retreating further into itself. He would often sit in the asylum gardens, muttering to himself, his fingers twitching as if still holding the ghostly instruments of his twisted work. Nurses and orderlies described a man whose rage seemed contained, but not diminished. It was as if the darkness was still within him, locked away, but not dead. He would stare into the distance, his eyes filled with a mixture of terror and satisfaction, as if reliving memories no one else could see. For some, the mystery of Jack the Ripper remains unsolved, a puzzle whose pieces never quite fit together. But for those who followed Kosminski's life, who looked into his eyes and saw the flicker of madness, there is no question of his guilt. They believed that the Ripper was not a shadowy figure from some distant world, but a man who walked among them, a man whose rage and sickness erupted in those dark nights of 1888. The people of Whitechapel whispered his name long after he was gone, as if his spirit still haunted the alleys he once prowled. The truth about Jack the Ripper's identity may never be known with complete certainty. But for the detectives who pored over the evidence, who followed Kosminski's trail through the fog-choked streets of Whitechapel, there was an almost unsettling clarity. He was a man whose life seemed to unravel in parallel with the killings, his mind slipping further into darkness, even as his violent impulses grew sharper and more deadly. To them, Kosminski's guilt felt undeniable, like a silent confession written in every tremor of his hands, every mutter beneath his breath. Years after Kosminski's death, the legends around Jack the Ripper have only grown. Stories circulated about his time in the asylum, how he would speak of visions and nightmares that tormented him night after night. The asylum staff, though never fully aware of his past, noted how he seemed haunted, as if locked in some battle with shadows that no one else could see. Some said he would even describe things, dark things, violent things, that matched too closely with the Ripper's crimes. But these were just rumors, passed among nurses and orderlies, never written down in any official report. For the people of Whitechapel, the tale of Aaron Kosminski became part of a folklore of sorts. They spoke of him in hushed tones, telling stories of a man consumed by darkness, whose hate had boiled over into the unthinkable. And though Whitechapel changed, modernized, and moved forward, the story of Jack the Ripper lingered, like a shadow cast over the city, forever tying his name to the fear that once gripped its streets. For some, the unsolved nature of the Ripper case remains a source of fascination, a mystery that will never be fully unraveled. But for those who saw the truth in Kosminski's eyes, who knew of the horrors hidden behind his muttering voice, there was no doubt. Jack the Ripper may have eluded justice in his lifetime, but his story became a warning, a reminder that even the quietest of men, the most unassuming figures, can carry horrors beyond imagination. And somewhere in the depths of his fractured mind, Kosminski took that truth with him to his grave, his name etched into the darkest chapters of London's history, not as a suspect, but as the face of terror itself.